In order to follow it, you'll need Introduction to Literature, the Godiva method of writing papers, and also Introduction to Literature, generic brand documentation method. If you don't have these, for those of you who are here today, of course, if you don't have these and you want to see this tape, you can always pick up any of the papers that you're missing from the literature area. Right upstairs above the pub, go in the door there, go up the stairs, go through the door to your right as you get to the top of the stairs. There'll be a, why do I always forget that word? The things you can't see over. Partition. There's a partition there, goes down and turns a little bit. Follow that, and just as you go around it, you'll see a big gray cabinet. And on the middle shelf of that big gray cabinet is all the papers from Introduction to Literature. So if you're missing anything, that's where you can find it. Now, today's lecture, of course, is going to be on how to write the paper and how to document the paper for literature. A good portion of this will probably be familiar to some of you, but hopefully it won't be as long as some of the other lectures. This is the boring stuff, but it's necessary. First, the papers themselves. As you can see from generic brand documentation method, the papers should be typed and they should be double spaced. They're easier to read that way. 1-inch margins all the way around. Sometimes they tell you to put 1.5 inch margin over on the left. If you have any questions in the technical details, you can follow really any format that you want. There's a good book by Turabian over in the bookstore on writing term papers. Most of the documentation that we do will not be all that complex. You'll rarely use government pamphlets. You probably won't use too many newspapers. So a lot of the documentation that this is going to cover won't help you for other courses. The thing to do then is to get like Turabian's book, and that has an example of every kind of documentation you can have, how to document the letters of somebody in an anthology, edited and translated by somebody else. Each of those little different ones are in that book. This is just a sort of a generic brand, non-brand name approach to documentation. The things that you need to document, I'm sorry, before I skip on to that, they should be typed. If you have to write the papers by hand, write legibly, blue or black ink. Red, green ink gets real hard to read late at night. And, of course, again, the easier you make it for somebody to read your paper, the better off you're going to be. If they have to puzzle over what you're saying, they lose track of your thought, and then the effectiveness of your paper goes downhill. On the front, your name, title of the course number, which in this case is English 158, title's Introduction to Literature. The section number, for my section, you can just put Thursday or Wednesday or Tuesday. You're doing papers for other literature classes, you may have to put down a specific section. And, of course, on our papers, the level that you're going on. If it's a high honors paper, put on the front of it high honors. If it's credit honors paper, put on the front that it's credit honors. Reason for that is that, quite naturally, I read the papers with different criteria depending on what level they're on. So, in other words, if I'm reading a credit paper, but I think I'm reading a high honors paper, I'm applying a lot stricter standards. So it's to your benefit to put on the papers what level they're going to be on. Now, you have to quote things, particularly in literature papers. Because we're going to be writing about the text, the most effective thing to do is to quote specifically from the text to support your points. As you notice, you have to document, you have to footnote, little raised number 1, and then documentation, either at the bottom of the page. Now, in the old-fashioned style, this style we're going to look at is the most modern style. But when we get to neoclassicists, you'll find out they're responsible for term papers and documentation, footnote, and so on. And footnoting used to be a whole lot of Latin. You used to have to put in ibid and loc sit and op sit, and a whole lot of Latin terms that nobody ever understood, and it was real complex. This is a simplified form. If you're going to go to Harvard or Yale or Rutgers, or one of those prestigious places, they'll probably make you use ibid and loc sit. Or if you get into phys ed, sociology, psychology, nursing, any of the majors that feel uncomfortable about their academic credentials, they will make you do the Latin documentation because they're trying to establish their credibility and so on. Literature's been around a long time. We have our academic credentials, so at least at Brookdale you won't have to worry about any of the Latin stuff. But you do need to document. You need to document for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you quote somebody's words in a paper, there's no way for the reader to be sure that you haven't quoted them out of context. So what a reader might want to do is to look up your sources to see, did Melville really say that? First they want to check that is it actually quoted correctly, and then to see it in context. Because quite often, as you know, you can take words out of context and use them to make them say exactly the opposite of what they say. You know, it's like the movie reviews where the guy really said this is an incredible waste of money, and then the ads for the movie come out and say incredible ... New York Times. Put the 3 ellipsis marks in, you can make anything do anything. So people in literature, especially literature teachers, don't trust anybody. They're kind of cynical. They read a lot of naturalism. You'll see when we get to naturalism why that would make you cynical and pessimistic. In any case, they want to know if you're quoting correctly, if it really says what you say it says, and they want to be able to see the context. Now, in order to do that, they've got to be able to find the book and look it up. And that's what the documentation does. It says, this is where this quotation came from. Also, you need to document paraphrasing. In other words, if you take somebody else's words and you read it and put it into your own words, if your own words are pretty similar to the words that you've quoted, it won't need direct quotes around it anymore. But it will still need a footnote to indicate that this is a set of ideas which weren't yours that you got from somebody else. That's the third thing that you need to document. If you've read a number of, say, critics on the work that you're doing, and you've really taken their ideas, and they weren't ideas which you could have arrived at yourself. In other words, if you hadn't read this critic, it would never have dawned on you that this might be the interpretation for the story. Then you should footnote that. There's not much else that a person has in literature except his words and his ideas. I mean, they're the coin of the realm in this field. So naturally, people in literature feel very strongly towards giving credit for who said it and for where the ideas came from. That's the whole purpose for documentation, so that we can be sure that you're quoting accurately, that the person says what you say that he said, and also so that you can give credit for ideas which you would not have had on your own. You don't need to footnote things like dates unless there is an argument about whether the date is accurate. For example, there are certain manuscripts that may have been written in one year, may have been written in another. There you would need to footnote a date. If you said, and in Young Goodman Brown, written in 1843, and there may be some argument about when it was written, then you would footnote it to indicate where you got that particular date from. And then, of course, your reader would be able to either accept that or reject it, depending on how they feel about the argument of when the thing was produced. That's our main reason for the documentation. As it says there, no more than about a third of your paper ought to be in direct quotation, especially in the papers for introduction to literature. What I'm really interested in your papers is, can you interpret something on your own, take a position, and then defend that position? There are no hard and fast absolute meanings to any of the stuff that we're going to be reading, at least not as far as I'm concerned. So what I'm looking for is your ability to make an interpretation and then defend the interpretation. There is no single right and wrong answer to probably anything in literature. So I'm interested in your own ideas. The originality of the paper, as far as I'm concerned, is worth more than a paper would be that's got quotes from 8 or 9 different critics in it. I'm sort of down on critics. I don't know if Rutgers has changed, but a million years ago when I went there, it used to be that if you were an undergraduate, you could not have an original idea on your own in the paper. Because you were an undergraduate, you had no status to have original ideas. You have to get a PhD before you can have original ideas. Although if you notice, most of the people who have PhDs have 0 when it comes to original ideas. In any case, everything that you said had to have been cited from somebody else. A critic had to say it first, so you had to go out and get a home. You could write your paper, but if you wanted it accepted, you'd have to find somebody else with prestige who had said the same things that you wanted to say. Now, I'm not really as much interested in that. I like people's original ideas. I am interested, however, in your being able to form a rational argument, a rational defense of the position that you take. So we want to keep a minimum as far as the direct quotation is concerned. The paper shouldn't be a whole lot of different pieces from somewhere else all patched together, and you're not in the paper at all. It's just the stuff that you collected like a pack rat and stuck together in a reasonable order. That's not a really good paper. A good paper ought to be your interpretation of something and a rational defense of that interpretation. You put the footnote at the end of the quotation. Every once in a while, somebody comes with them at the beginning. So it's a direct quotation, you have the quote, and you have little quotation marks outside it, and then outside that, a half a line above the line of text is where you put the footnote number. The footnotes are numbered sequentially through the entire paper. If you have 25 footnotes, they'll be numbered from 1 to 25. They don't go, now that some of the papers that, I don't know about our text, but in many texts where they have footnotes, there'll be explanatory footnotes. And explanatory footnotes are always at the bottom of the page. Those aren't really the kinds that we'll be using, but in that case they do 1, 2, 3, and the next page has 1, 2, 3. We don't do it that way. It'll be sequential all the way through the text, 1 to 25, however many they are. You won't have 25 footnotes. You probably only have maybe 3 or 4, 5 maybe. Yes.
Should the footnotes be at the bottom of the page or should it be a separate page?
They should be on a separate page in the back. I'm going to keep calling them footnotes because it's easier for me to remember, but they're really endnotes, yeah. We won't be using footnotes. Footnotes are, if you've ever had a type of paper with footnotes on.
I know, it's hard to space at the bottom, how much space you
No matter how much space you use, there always ends up being an extra quote in there, and you've got no room to put it, and the whole page has to be typed over again. Generally, there's been a movement away from footnotes entirely, except on maybe a thesis or your doctoral dissertation or some formal paper that you'd be submitting to a journal of some sort. But generally, the papers you'll do in most colleges, and especially ones you do here, will be doing endnotes, even though I keep calling them footnotes, which means you have the raised one, but all of them will be listed in the back rather than at the bottom of the page.
Also, when you're writing a footnote in the paper, if it's only like one line of a direct quotation, you can put it in the body of the paper. Is that
Yes.
right? And then if it's like, say, a paragraph that is a direct quotation, don't you indent and put it, you don't have to put it in quotes, but you put it single spaced, like you would double space the text, and then you would single space the direct quote without quotations.
Any quote that's more than 3 lines long, you ought to do that with. Single space and indent it. And then you don't need to put quotes around it. You still need the footnote down at the end, though, to indicate where it came from. Yes, single space quote. Oh, use of ellipsis. You leave words out, you put in 3 dots to indicate words have been left out here. If you leave words out, if you add words of your own to make the phrase come out right, you need to put a little bracket around the words that you've inserted so the reader knows those are not the words of the original author. And again, if you are quoting within your text sometimes, if the quote is short enough, only 2 or 3 words that you're quoting, you can just put in parentheses after it, Hawthorne, or maybe the name of your text. As you'll see here, we're doing things by books being referred to with the same name, here and after referred to as. I'll show you that in a second, but so you would just use that same quote up in the text. Now, the things that we need in a footnote for books. Books differ slightly from periodicals. We need slightly different information. There's a reason for each of the parts that are included in a footnote. Now, notice number 1, you indent 5 spaces, go up half a line and put in the number for the footnote. Then we need the author's name. First name first. When we get to bibliography, you'll see that that's reversed because the bibliographies are in alphabetical order. But for footnotes, first name first, comma, the title of the work. Now, we'll be quoting in literature. Most of the time, you'll be dealing with shorter works, like a short story out of the Fiction 100 anthology, or a poem out of a collection of poems. The poem would be in quotes. The short story would be in quotes. If you're quoting from a play, it will be underlined, even if it's in an anthology, because plays are usually complete works in themselves. So you have the author's name, comma, the name of the short story, the poem, whatever you're dealing with, in quotes, then a comma, then, if applicable, the title of the anthology underlined. course, we need to know that the title of the anthology is important because different anthologies may have different versions of the same story. That's where literature differs a lot from science. The version of the story you have may be different from other versions. Whole lines are sometimes left out. Henry James has a novel that he did in which he took out different sections of the novel. Whole chapters were put out and changed when it went from its American edition to its British edition, which when we get to the place where it was published, you'll see why that would be significant. It may not have an anthology. If it's a complete work itself, if you were quoting from a novel, you would just have the author's name, comma, the name of the novel underlined. But when you're quoting from anthologies, you have the author's name, the quote from the smaller source, the short story, whatever, in quotes, and then a comma and the name of the anthology. We also need, if applicable, number 6, the edition. For example, Fiction 100, we have the 3rd edition. The 2nd edition has different stories in, 4 or 5 different ones. So that's important to know. So if it does give an edition number, you should put the edition number after the title of the anthology. You won't have editions on novels generally. You'll have different printings, but the edition generally stays the same. Mostly you just have to worry about that, as I said, on anthologies. Then you need the name of the editor or editors after the name of the anthology, after 3rd edition or whatever it is. That's comma before it, and its first name first, comma, ed, period, to indicate they're the editor. If they're translators, the translators would also go in this position here, and you would have Edward E. Translator, comma, Trans, period. If you had both edited, let's say you had a quote from a story by Camus, which is also in Fiction 100. Well, that's translated from the French. So you'd have Albert Camus, comma, the guest in quotes, comma, Fiction 100, underlined, comma, 3rd edition. I think it's James A. Pickering, comma, ed, comma, and then the name of the translator, which will probably be at the bottom of that page. And then, in parentheses, the city that the anthology itself was published in, or where the novel was published. All that is the copyright information that you get from the copyright page in the front of the book. The reason we need this city is because sometimes there's a different edition published, say, in London than there is published in America. And in fact, in some textbooks, there are different editions for each section of the country. So that a Southern history textbook, sometimes even a Southern literature textbook, will be different than a Northern literature textbook or a Western textbook. So where it's published is of some significance. It's not just another thing to put in there. Then a colon and the name of the publisher. If and company is usually included, incorporated is usually left off. So like Doubleday and Company Incorporated is their real title. You would just put Doubleday and Company. Scribner and Son, so I think it's just Scribner's now. But the name of the publisher. Again, that's important because different publishers sometimes put out different versions of a work. Especially if it's in translation, it's going to be different. And quite often they will take their original sources from 2 different texts, and the story may have differences in it depending on who put it out. And after that, the year of publication. That gets to be very important in things like Walt Whitman. Whitman brought out the same book of poetry, Leaves of Grass, 6 times. And each time he brought it out, he put new poems in, took some of the old poems out, revised some of the poems that were already in it. So if you're looking at the 1856 edition of Leaves of Grass, you're looking at a totally different book from the 1880 edition of Leaves of Grass. So that the copyright date then is of grave importance, more importance than it would be in science or in history probably. In literature, it's very important when the version of the story you have was published. And then, of course, after that, which is in the closed parenthesis, then we have the page number that you cite. If you cite one page, it's little p, period, and the page number. If you cite more than one page, it's 2 p's, 2 small p's, and a period. And if they're 2 separate pages, it would be 26, comma, 35. If they're continuous and there's more than 2, it would be like 26-28. That means this was paraphrased from page 25 through page 28. If you quote something that begins on the bottom of the page and runs over to the next, you can do P period 58 FF, or F, page following or pages following, either way. But most of the time you'll just use P period and the page number. And then a period at the end of the quotation. And then, of course, in our style that we're going to be doing here, you'll have a line that says, hereinafter cited as, and then you will give the work a shortened title based on, you can refer to it on the basis of the title of the story, on the basis of the title of the anthology, if you only have one quote from that one anthology, or even the title of, or even by the author's name, if you only have one quote from one book by that author. If you've got more than one, then it's better to try to pick out a word which will key the reader into what source they're looking for. For example, there, the first one is Edgar Allan Poe, name of the author. Why I Don't Like Birds, name of the story, the article. Ravens and Other Odd Birds, title of the anthology. Wentworth Sly James, the editor of the anthology. Published in New York. Company was published by Tripleday and Company, and the year it was published, 1938, and the page quoted from page 47. Hereinafter referred to as birds. Now you notice birds is in quotes because I took it out of the title of the article rather than out of the title of the anthology. If I had taken it out of the title of the anthology, I could also have had birds underlined. I could have called it anything though. It could have been hereinafter referred to as Poe, hereinafter referred to as ravens, hereinafter, any key word that the reader will be able to identify the book by. It's up to you, whatever it is. Second book there by Walter Pidgeon, The Use of Statues. You notice this isn't in an anthology, this is just a novel. It happens to be a third edition, means he revised it a couple times. Done in New York by Triple Cross Publishing in 1971. The quote is made from page 43. Now the second time that we've referred to Poe's book, we don't need to write out all that information now. That only needs to be done once. So when he wants to go look that book up, we've given them all the information they need. Second time we refer to it, all we use is the key word. I'm sorry, there's a mistake in number 2. That should have a line in there that says, hereinafter referred to as statues, underlined. Now, the footnote number 3 there refers back to page 24 of Poe's book. The fourth footnote in the example refers back to Pidgeon's book. We're going to refer to that as statues all the time, so statues is all we need. Page 11. Number 5 refers also to Pidgeon's book, exactly the same page. Now, I think even in this style you could use, if you wanted, ibid, which means exactly the same as above. I think the real technical translation is something like in the place cited or already cited or some nonsense like that. But it means that what's above it is exactly the same. Nothing changes. Or you could just use statutes page 211 again, depending. Either one of those is acceptable. Any questions on how you do a footnote for a book?
I just had a question. In the past, I've always done, if I was going to use, as far as I know, you can only do this for one book, but the main book that you're going to be doing the paper on, can you just write out once all the information, then write hereinafter cited within the text, something, I forget
Yes.
exactly what it
Yes,
is.
you
And
could.
then after every footnote, rather than having to put a footnote number, you can just put in parentheses the page number, you put page
Number. Let's say,
whatever, and then they know that it's, when they read the footnotes or the endnotes, when it says hereinafter cited within the text, they know that the page, it's from that book.
what you would do would be, yes, that in fact is a good way to save some space on the footnotes. Let's say that we could change number 1 there. And instead of saying hereinafter cited as or hereinafter referred to as, we could say hereinafter cited in the text as birds. And then every time we had a quote from Poe, after the quote, if it was a short one, we would just put parentheses, birds, and the page number, and close
Can you
parentheses.
just put the page number, do you have to put a?
You have to put the key word, because there may be sometimes when you're not quoting from that source.
But if you put the key word, that means you can use more than one, you can do that for more than one book? Like if you have 2 books, say you're using, that you have extensive number of
Oh yes, you can
quotes,
put most of them
then
up in the
you can
text.
put hereinafter cited within the text as birds, and then for another one you can say hereinafter cited within the text as statues, and then just, because the ones
And
that I've
then-
done in the past, I've only done it for one, so I didn't even bother putting a key word.
No, you can't use it, you could do it with all the footnotes if you wanted. That would be an even shorter form of the generic footnoting. That is, the only footnotes you'd really have at the end would be the main footnotes where you cite everything, the publisher and the time and the day, and then your hereinafter would say hereinafter referred to in the text, and then in the text you would just put parentheses, the keyword, comma, and the page number, instead of putting them in your endnotes. That would save a lot of space, and that's often done and is generally acceptable. So if you want to do it that way, of course, you can. The only difference is that you would have to change your hereinafter cited phrase to hereinafter cited in the text as, and the keyword. And then they'd note it from then on, whenever you refer to that book, you'll just have it in parentheses in the text, keyword, comma, and the new page number. Now, the magazine footnotes are slightly different because there's different information in them, naturally. We still indent 5 spaces. We still go up half a line, put in the number of the footnote. We still have the author, first name first. The difference here is that instead of having a short story or a poem, although actually a poem would still work, because a lot of, if you're doing little magazines and journals and stuff, they have poems in them. So sometimes this will be similar to the book footnote in that regard. The title of the work in quotes, then the name of the magazine underlined, the volume number if it's available. Usually that'll be in the front too. A lot of times on the table of contents page where it has the date, and then it'll have volume number and issue number. Sometimes you can put both of those down. But they're not always there, so if you don't have them, it's not absolutely crucial. You should have them if you can find them easily. And then in parentheses, the date of the magazine. June 83, spring 81. If it comes out every week or every day or whatever, then you need the full date, September 9th, 1982 or whatever it is. And then the page number, the same as before. And a hereinafter statement, hereinafter cited as, and your key word. So in most instances, it's very similar to the book. The differences are that we have the name of the magazine, and then of course in parentheses the date of the issue. There are 2 examples down there. Number 6 refers to an article by Anne Dunn, 3 weeks on the run with a metaphysical poet. That's in the Journal of Esoteric Pomposity. Anne Dunn was married to John Donne, whose song we had, Go and Catch a Falling Star. They eloped, which was not something that you did in those days. In fact, when her father was pretty big in the Anglican Church, and when he caught up with him, he had John put in jail for 3 weeks. And in fact, John Donne wrote a poem about it. It said, John Donne, Anne Dunn, undone. They had been caught up with. So that's a literary allusion there, that title. Journal of Esoteric Pomposity. XLV is of course the volume number. In parentheses, the date. This thing comes out every week. And there's a mistake there. It should have after 1983, it should have P period 61 period. Hereinafter cited as pomposity. You notice I'm quoting from the journal here. I'm using the journal's title rather than the article title. I could have said hereinafter cited as metaphysical, hereinafter cited as on the run. Any keywords that I wanted to use would be all right. And again, if you're going to cite it in the text, you have to say hereinafter cited in the text as. Number 7 is another article by Richard Hartley, The Significance of Wolf Motifs in the Works of Jack London, the title of the article. It's the East Washington University Quarterly. That's the title of the magazine or journal. 43. You notice it doesn't always have to be in Roman numerals. Some magazines put their journal numbers in Roman numerals and use this Arabic numerals for the issue number. Some put them both in Arabic numerals. Whichever they do, that's what you put down on the footnote. Then it's the spring 1983 issue, and we quote from pages 10 through 16. How do I know that's 10 through 16 and not 10 and 16?
Yes.
It's the dash. If it was 10 and 16, it would be 10, comma 16, period. And then, of course, our hereinafter statement, hereinafter stated as wolf. Number 8, footnote number 8 refers to what? Statues, the second book. Number 9, first magazine, Anne Dunn's article. And number 10 refers to Hartley's article. Again, if they were you could have those also up in the text in parentheses, wolf, parenthesis, quote, wolf, unquote, comma, page 211, 219, period, close quote. Any questions on footnotes? No? Okay, that part should be pretty simple. Now we'll go on to the bibliography and get that out of the way. The bibliography, as you can see there, is an alphabetical listing of the books, which is why you'll see the first part of the entry is changed. The author's name is turned around, last name first to make it easier to alphabetize. The bibliography which we will use, you'll only need to put in your bibliography the books you actually quote from in the paper. There are other bibliographies where you're required to put down all of the books that you read in preparing that paper, whether you quote from them or not. In ours, you just need to make a bibliography for what's quoted. In fact, there are all kinds of different bibliographies. There are ones where you have to cite all of the books and annotate them, put in a little line or two about what the book, whether the book was a good source or whether it was too wordy, or your comment in general on the book. But the ones we're doing is the simplest possible one, just the book cited in the paper itself. Now that little thing there all in capitals is very important. That's what documentation is all about. It's to prevent somebody from passing off as their words the words that belong to somebody else. If you don't footnote your paper correctly, there is no way in the world for your instructor to know whether you intentionally are trying to put somebody else's words in there as your own or not. And if you go to, it depends on who you have. Instructors all vary. If you happen to hit a real neoclassicist, you might get put in for plagiarism because you haven't put quotes around or haven't cited the source that you're quoting from. They may assume that you're trying to pass those words off. I wouldn't assume that, but some people would, and you have to guard against that. Plagiarism is a big thing. In a lot of places where if you seem to have plagiarized your paper, that's it. You're out of school. And there have been a couple people in the last 2 or 3 years who they've discovered had lied about their credentials, or who plagiarized their dissertation or their thesis in order to get their credentials, and who've been fired from their jobs because of it. So it doesn't just stay behind you. It'll follow you for a long time. So be very careful when you're using the words that you give credit where credit is due. The ideas come from somewhere else. The words come from somewhere else. You've got to say where they came from. Bibliography, again, the list of books at the back, the books that you've used. Main differences are the author's name comes last name first instead of first name. So it'll be Poe, comma, Edgar Allan, period. Notice in the first one it was Edgar Allan Poe, comma. That's the main difference between them. Then the title of the book or the anthology. Now if you're quoting, say, from Fiction 100, you don't need to put in Hawthorne, Young Goodman Brown, Fiction 100. You just need to cite Fiction 100 because that's the only book that you use. You've already cited the place in Fiction 100 in your footnotes. So the title of the book, period, place of publication, no parenthesis around it this time. Still a colon after the place, the publisher, comma, the year of publication, and a period. In books, you don't need to indicate all of the pages that you quoted. The entry for a magazine is similar. Author's name, last name first, comma, first name, period. Title of the article in quotation marks, and a period within the quotation marks, separate item. Then the title of the magazine underlined, followed by a comma, the date that it came out, comma, the page number, and a period. And you can see the examples of it there. In the magazine, periodical, journal entries, you do need to include the pages quoted. So as you can see under and done, at the end of that we have page 25 and 41. All the pages cited in your footnote should then reappear in your bibliography for magazines, periodicals, journal entries. For books as a whole, you don't need to include the words. So that's the main difference between them. In a footnote, author's first name comes first, the whole thing is followed by a comma. In the bibliography, his last name comes first, and the whole entry is followed by a period. There are no parentheses in the bibliography around the location, publisher, and date. In the footnote there are, and you don't need to include the pages. You don't need to include the smaller work in the bibliography.
Is that at the end?
Yeah, this is a separate page at the end. Now your footnotes will appear at the end of the paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, so on through 20. Just like they appear over on the first page of this sample, except without all that stuff in the middle. And then another page you'll have which will be titled Bibliography and underlined, and that will be the list of books. The bibliography will be pretty short, probably. You since you're doing so much original work, you may only have quotations from maybe Fiction 100. Say you're doing you're doing Poe, and you're just only parts of your paper that you're going to do any quoting is where you're quoting from his stories to prove your point. Then you may have a relatively short bibliography, only one book in it. I don't expect to have too many in our. There'll be too many books involved in anybody's bibliography, but you should be aware of how to do this. Any question on the documentation? Okay. Now, how to write the paper. As I said, this is going to be. What I'll do with this section here is. This is an easy way to write a paper if you have trouble developing your ideas. In other words, if you sit down and if you looked at those things and went, oh my God, I got to do 7 pages, then this method will probably help you because you can use it to develop essays for the short essay or the long essay part of the test. You can use it for any paper that you write. It's relatively simple. I've called it the Godiva method because I thought that would be a good mnemonic. A naked lady on a horse ought to stick. Well, I guess if you're a female, it won't stick in your head all that much. Sorry, that's a little male chauvinism there. But in any case, you still heard of Lady Godiva, so that might stick in your head. And of course, it's a mnemonic. The word is made up out of generalization, organization, definition, detail, illustrative example, variation, and the A is also from variation. Now, what's listed under there is basically the method that you would use for developing any single idea, and also for a paper. This will apply to paragraphs as well as to papers as a whole. First thing that we need to do to write the paper, and this will take you some time, is to write the thesis sentence for the paper. I mean, probably if you took English 125, 126, that term is familiar, should be familiar with it. The thesis is the generalization that you're going to prove in the paper. Everything in the paper, once you make that thesis statement, has to go towards developing or proving that thing to be true. So it obviously takes some time to formulate what is it I'm going to set out to prove here in the paper. Combined with that will also be a method sentence. What the method sentence essentially says is the basic reasons why your generalization is true. Thesis is what you're going to prove. The method sentence is the 3 or 4 reasons why that is true in the order in which you are going to cover them in the paper. For example, this is an outline for a paper comparing Gerard Manley Hopkins, who's a modern metaphysical poet, and when we get to metaphysical, you'll see a little of that, and Edward Taylor, who's the first American metaphysical poet. Now, the first clause that you see in there is really just introduction, despite being separated by almost 2 centuries. The thesis is what comes next. Edward Taylor and Gerard Manley Hopkins are remarkably similar. That's what I'm going to prove, that they're similar. Then there are 4 ways in which they are similar. These are the 4 reasons why they're similar. Are remarkably similar in their use of convoluted syntax, their unusual diction, their unlikely comparisons, and their loosely structured form. How many sections are there going to be in this paper? 4. Each one will treat a different reason for the thesis being true. Now, the next easiest way to go on with the paper from that. Now, getting your thesis and method sentence may take you some time because you want to formulate that perfectly. But once you've got that down, the rest of it is simple because the paper is already laid out for you. Now what you need is a generalization for each of the 4 things that you're going to prove. It doesn't have to be 4. In fact, given the length of most of the papers, 3 will probably be a better number for most of you to try to go for. Try to go for too many, it either makes the paper too long or you don't give enough attention to one of the reasons. So you don't have to have 4 reasons. 3 would probably be all right for most papers we're doing. This one is going to have 4, however. And we need, for each of those 4 reasons, a generalization which will begin that section of the paper. Now, if you look, you'll see underneath that, generalizations, number 1, these are topic sentences, which are thesis sentences for each individual part of the paper. Now, I've taken their similarity in terms of convoluted syntax, and I'm going to put that into a complete sentence that the whole of that section of the paper is going to be about. Taylor's use of convoluted syntax created ambiguities at least as complex as those as Hopkins 2 centuries later. Now that's what I'm going to set out to prove, that both of these guys had convoluted syntax which was hard to understand. First thing I do to develop it, notice I've already gone through generalization and organization. Now we're into definition. In that thesis sentence, Taylor's use of convoluted syntax created ambiguities at least as complex, etc., I would look for a word or words which need to be defined. Words which the reader may not understand, words which I may be using differently than the reader may understand them. What words do you think there need a sentence or two explaining their meaning? Convoluted syntax. That's the first thing. What do I mean by convoluted? Is one word out of order enough? Or do a lot of words have to be out of order? Is it convoluted syntax if he dropped some words out, but kept the words that he left in their normal order, but still made it hard to understand? What do I mean by convoluted syntax? So there's a sentence or maybe two there, explaining what convoluted syntax is. After I've defined convoluted syntax, I might want to define maybe another word in there. What would that be? Ambiguity. Now, I might just define convoluted syntax. I might figure everybody knows or ought to know what ambiguity is, and I'm using it in a general way. If I'm using it in any way which is not the way it's generally used, then of course I would have to explain what I meant by ambiguity as well. So in other words, what I'm doing is restating my thesis in different ways, ways in which we'll define words which I think are somewhat ambiguous. Now, after I've defined anything in my thesis or in my topic sentence which needs to be defined, then I go on to add detail. In this case, I would probably want to add some detail about what I meant by convoluted syntax. Let's say I had defined convoluted syntax as any interruption of the normal order of words in a sentence, their normal prose order. That's definition. Detail would be then if I went on and said, now, there are different kinds of convoluted syntax. A poet might leave words out and make the sentence confusing. A poet might take words out of context and out of sequence and move them to a different part of the sentence. He might add words which are really not related to the main idea of the sentence. All that would make the sentence more complex. What I've just done now, orally, is to fill in detail about my definition. I've now got about 6 lines of text in my paper done already. The next thing, of course, is illustrative examples. You want people to understand what I mean by convoluted syntax. I've given some types of convoluted syntax. Then I might give an example of each kind, so the reader knows what I mean by convoluted syntax. If I've got a lot of space to fill, I would probably give some general examples of convoluted syntax, not taken from Taylor or Hopkins. However, if I don't have a lot of space to work with, my examples of what convoluted syntax is will probably come from Taylor. And I'll give a couple of these out of Taylor by way of explaining and illustrating my definition of convoluted syntax. Then I will go on and compare those with some more illustrative examples taken from Hopkins. Remember, this is going to be a comparison and contrast paper. So you have to do comparing and contrasting as you go through. So now the structure I have for this first section of my paper, I've got a generalization. I've defined the words that I needed to define in it, namely convoluted syntax in particular. I've added some detail about what I mean by convoluted syntax. I've given some illustrative examples by one author to explain what convoluted syntax is, and then I've continued to develop it by making comparisons of other convoluted syntax, similar types, by the second author. Now that's going to take me, that's got to be 10, 15 lines of paper already. In other words, you can see how easy, just from one sentence now, just by following this step-by-step method, you generate a page or more of text. After that, after I've illustrated my thesis, after I've gotten some illustrative examples in there, so the examples in it to prove that I'm right also, then I need to go on to the next section of the paper. When I do so, the best thing to do is to link the two sections of the paper together in some way. There are a number of ways to do this. One is to restate in different words the premise of that section of the paper. So I might have as a transition both Taylor and Hopkins are difficult to read because of their syntax. Now that summarizes what I said in the section, and it now sets us up to go on to the next section of the paper. There are a number of ways to link sections of a paper together. One is by using linking words. Words which indicate the relationship between the ideas in one part of the paper and the ideas in another. For example, however. However indicates right off the bat that the second section of the paper is going to offer some seeming contradiction to the first section of the paper. Or I might have therefore. That tells me that I'm coming to a conclusion drawn based on what went immediately before. Or I might use moreover, which means I'm adding words. Or thus. Another way to do it is to repeat words, keywords from the previous section of the paper. For example, a transitional link between section 1 and 2 of this paper might be something like even more complex than the ambiguities created by convoluted syntax are those created by the use of coined words and the taste for the unusual or often archaic diction. Notice now I've taken a keyword from the top section and I've stated what I'm going to discuss in the second section of the paper. I've linked the two together. Once you've got on to the next section, of course, you just start over. You've got a generalization there. In this case, it happens to be both poets used coined words and had a taste for unusual, often archaic words. What needs definition here? Coined words. What do I mean by a coined word? It happens to be a word that the poet made up. I may also need to explain what I mean by archaic words. Does the word have to be old to be archaic, or is it simply enough that it's not used? Does it have to be 2 or 3 centuries old, or does it just happen to be one which is passed out of common use? For example, groovy might be an archaic word. Nobody has used that since 1970 at the latest. But so for my definition, maybe that would be an archaic word because it isn't used anymore. I need to explain to the reader what that is. Once I've done that, of course, then I'm going to offer some more detail about archaic words or about coined words. Maybe, for example, I'll put in how coined words are used. I might say that he coins a word whenever he comes across an experience that he can't find a good sense organ to associate with. Or I might say that he uses coined words particularly whenever he's naming places. In either case, I'm adding more detail about the use of coined words. Then, of course, I would go on to give some illustrative examples, compare those examples with some other examples, since this is a comparison-contrast paper. Then make my little restatement of the whole section of the paper, use words from that, or use linking words to link that paper to the next section of the paper, and go on to my next generalization. Then go step by step through that, define what needs to be defined, give detail, give illustrative examples, tie it together, go on to the next section, finish the 4th section, and then we come down to the conclusion of your paper. There are, as you can see there, at least 3 different ways to conclude a paper. One is with a summary. You take all the basic ideas of the paper, or the basic ideas of your, which is even easier, go back to your thesis in method sentence, and just restate it in a different way. You can, in fact, restate it exactly the way it's been stated in your original thesis sentence. In other words, one way to end a paper is just to restate your thesis sentence. All you need to do is prepare, or maybe head it with therefore, and then a restatement of your thing. Or you might summarize the arguments that you've made, that they've used convoluted syntax, coined words, metaphysical conceits, and odd rhyme schemes to create ambiguities in their work. So in other words, I'm summarizing the reasons why that's so, and I restate it at the end. The classiest way to end it is also the most difficult and the one that was most likely to lead you into trouble, but I put it in there anyway. And that is, you summarize your thesis, and then you make a second generalization that could also be derived from the facts you've presented. See, that's the key thing. You can't just make another generalization that looks like it needs a whole new paper to explain it. In this case, the generalizations are their use of convoluted syntax
unusual diction, metaphysical conceits, and off rhymes. Remember the 4 areas I've covered, summarized. Make Hopkins and Taylor seem surprisingly similar. There's my thesis. Inheritors of the metaphysical tradition. See, now through the paper I've discussed the metaphysical tradition, and I'm extending. I'm making a new generalization, but it's already been proven in the paper. I can't, though, go off on a whole new idea and end the paper saying, make Hopkins and Taylor surprisingly similar, although their choice of subject matter and the overall form of their poems is enormously different. See, now I'm going off on a whole new idea I haven't developed in the paper. That wouldn't be a good paper. Best way is summary and restatement, usually. At least the safest. Any questions on how you would develop a paper then?
You'd have to know your second generalization if you use the last conclusion before you even start the paper, right?
You might not. You might get to the end and then you saw another way to throw metaphysical in. You'd realize that your paper would lead to more than one conclusion. If you do know it in advance, it would be a lot easier. Yes, you're right. If you're going to do that last summary and extension, you probably ought to know where the paper could have gone to. You're right. You would need to know both of those before you started. Generally. Although sometimes, by the time you finish your second draft, you realize that you're proving two things at the same time. Then you could use it. It's tricky, though. It's a very, it's a classy thing to do. It makes a paper look really good if you can do it successfully. But it's dangerous. You can ruin a perfectly good paper because you get it back and the guy will say, this was great as far as it went, but you never developed the last idea that you brought up. So it's very tricky. You have to, be careful when you use it. Yes?
Will you accept as subjects authors whom we have not read in class, or only the authors we have read in class?
No, I'd like to really see authors that we haven't read in class. I think that I'm going to, in fact, in a second, I'm going to go to the objectives and show you how to develop one of those papers on each of the ones. So when I get there, I'll be able to tell you for sure whether it was stuff only work. Let's see, the high honors is one work. Doesn't say anything, I think, in the high honors part about whether or not they have to be people we've read in class or not. I'll tell you the only thing I have against using people that we've done in class. That is that I hear my own ideas coming back. And that's boring. Makes it hard to read papers. I like original ideas, so that's why I've discouraged people from using the works that we've used in class. Let me point out one other thing since the credit honors and the high honors both are comparison contrast. That's why they are honors and high honors. They're more intellectually difficult than simply applying a term. There are two main ways of developing a comparison and contrast paper. So you can see them there at the bottom. One is tandem development. This is a tandem development of the paper that's being discussed up above there, the one between Taylor and Hopkins. Now, if you do it in the tandem way, the first part of your paper develops everything about Taylor. How Taylor used convoluted syntax, how he coined words, how he used metaphysical conceits, how loose his form was. Second section of the paper then goes on to deal with Hopkins. But it doesn't just deal with Hopkins. There is a third way to do the paper, which I haven't listed. The reason I haven't listed is because it leads people into too many problems. And that is, you do all of Taylor, you do all of Hopkins, and then you have a third section where you do the actual comparing and contrasting, which is generally shorter than the other two sections. The problem with that is that people quite often do Taylor, do Hopkins, and say goodbye. And I got to put them together and figure out how the hell they're similar and different. That's not a good paper. If it's a comparison and contrast paper, you have to make the comparisons and contrasts. I only have to read about them. You've got to make them. If it's not there, you can't say, well, but it was obvious. It isn't obvious unless you make it obvious. So what you need to do then to avoid that is either to have the third section. The reason I don't like that is even if you do put the third section, it tends to be redundant. You have to keep repeating stuff that you've already said further up to prove that your statements are true. Either that or you have to make unsupported generalizations that require the reader to go back and find the evidence for it. Neither of those is an effective paper. So the better way is if you do tandem, everything by Taylor, and then when you do Hopkins, you don't just say, this is what Hopkins' syntax was. You say, this is how Hopkins' syntax is similar to that of Taylor. This is how Hopkins' diction is similar to that of Taylor. Not, this is what Hopkins' diction was. This is how his diction is different from that of Taylor. Each one, then you come to your conclusion, which would allow you to kind of a restatement. Any of those conclusions will work on the tandem comparison. The other kind of comparison you can see right next to it is continuous comparison. The same thing applies there. The first section of your paper is going to be about convoluted syntax. You talk about what convoluted syntax is, you talk about how Taylor uses it, and then you talk about how the way Hopkins uses it is similar to the way Taylor uses it. You don't do convoluted syntax, how Taylor uses it, how Hopkins uses it, and on to archaic words. You've got to make the contrast. You can't just put out what they do, you've got to make the connection between the two. So, continuous comparison, you do Taylor, then you do not Hopkins, but how Hopkins is similar. Taylor's choice of words, unusual archaic words, then how Hopkins' choice of unusual archaic words is similar to that of Taylor. You've got to make sure you make the comparisons all the way through. You can do them in one section, you can do them all in the second section, you can do them as you go along, but you do have to make the comparisons and contrast. Just putting the information in and leaving it up to the reader is not sufficient. Any questions then on the two methods of comparison and contrast paper? Okay, let's take a look at the objectives and try and apply this a little bit to maybe how, I'll try and do a thesis sentence or maybe on one or two of these anyhow. First of all, for credit. Now, in credit, you only need to apply one term out of the, what have we got, 150 terms now, 100, 200 terms, something like that. So you got a pretty wide latitude to choose from. Choose one that you think you know pretty well and that you can apply pretty easily. Once you've picked that out, then you need to pick out an author to deal with. In this case, I think we only have one author, right? And probably you limit it to one work. After all, it's only the credit, it's the lowest level paper. It's not as challenging as some of the other levels are. So let's say that, now you notice the samples there, the use of plot in Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. So the first thing I decided, I really understand plot. So I'm going to write my paper on plot. Then I looked around maybe through Fiction 100, or in this case, I could also use Hemingway. I mean, it could be written on the novel, you could use plot too. But let's say I like short stories the most. I'm going to do short stories, I'm going to do plot in short stories. Then I pick out one short story that I like. In this case, it's Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. And now I have to have something to state about the use of plot in Young Goodman Brown. You could take that the plot's well done or it's not well done. That's one way to approach it. Another way might be how he uses plot. For example, this would be a thesis sentence for a credit paper. Hawthorne uses plot, especially in the sense of what he leaves out, to create an ending with several possible meanings. Then I would go on and show how, first of all, he creates a number of different meanings in Young Goodman Brown, and then how he creates those meanings by leaving things out of the plot, by not telling us whether Young Goodman Brown really dreamed about the adventure that he had. We haven't read Young Goodman Brown yet, but I think we do Young Goodman Brown when we get to Romanticism. In any case, that would be what a thesis sentence would be like for that. Then I would go on probably to explain what plot is, show how he leaves out things in different ways to create an ambiguity in the plot, develop each of those, cite specific examples from the work, and then come to my conclusion that he has left this stuff out because he wanted more than one meaning at the end. He's manipulated plot. Another one might be another thesis sentence might be, because Hawthorne withholds information, we do not know whether good or evil triumphed or if indeed anything even happened. He withholds this information by manipulating the plot. Now that would work. Or he withholds this information in three ways. He doesn't tell us about what things that happened. The things that he does tell us about, he doesn't tell us about completely. And he contradicts or puts in a detail which can be understood in more than one way. That would be the three areas of the paper I'm going to develop. Another example there, I suppose, dramatic irony in Oedipus. Maybe a thesis sentence on that would be that dramatic irony is the chief purpose of the play. And everybody in the audience is going to experience dramatic irony because they know about what happens to Oedipus. And then I would go on and explain why the audience would know what was going to happen to Oedipus, how that created dramatic irony in them, and maybe the places in the plot where the most dramatic irony is created. When Oedipus pronounces this sentence on himself, when Oedipus refuses to listen to Tiresias, those could all be places where dramatic irony would be generated. Maybe I could have said, as another example for a thesis, Oedipus relies very strongly on dramatic irony in the play. Sophocles relies very heavily on dramatic irony in the play Oedipus Rex. It appears at, let's see, I could say it appears every time Oedipus gets in trouble or has an argument, or it appears every time Oedipus has a discussion with Creon, Jocasta, or Tiresias. And then that gives me the 3 sections of my paper. Then I would go on and show how dramatic irony occurs when Oedipus is talking to Jocasta. Every time he talks with her, the audience is sitting out there going, oh my God, it's his mother and he doesn't know it. Then I might say that whenever he battles with Tiresias, whenever he meets Tiresias, there's dramatic irony created because, and I would go on and show where Tiresias makes a prophecy and the audience knows it's going to come true, but Oedipus doesn't. How that would be correct, create dramatic irony. Any questions on how to develop a credit paper? You don't have to use this form. This is just an easy way to generate a lot of words. It's an easy way to have your things organized, to organize paper. But you can do it any way you want. Some people write their papers best by waiting until the night before and then reading the story over once and sitting down and writing exactly what they think. But unless you're a real good writer, unless you have a natural style, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So this way will help you if you do have any difficulties. For the honors paper, you notice you're doing a comparison and contrast of 2 authors from different historical periods. And you're going to compare them in terms of one term that we've used in class. The examples there, characterization, that's the term. I've decided I like the novel of all of the things that we've looked at so far. So I'm going to write in the novel, I'm going to talk about characterization in the novel. Now I need to find 2 authors that I like from different historical periods. Well, in this case I took Kurt Vonnegut and Henry James because they're so different in the way they create characters. That's something else you can, one of the things that might help you when you say, if you've got a contrast paper to do, the easiest thing to do is to find 2 people who are as different as possible because they'll give you more opportunities to contrast. Generally, when you pick authors from 2 different historical periods, you'll automatically have a whole lot of built-in easy contrast to do. So that topic might not be as difficult as it seems. Now, if I was going to carry out that paper, this would be a thesis sentence I would probably have written. Vonnegut's characterization derives from the tale, while that of James comes from the sketch. Now, that's going to be my thesis. Whenever I talk about Vonnegut, I'm going to talk about how Vonnegut's characterization seems to have things come out from the tale. So I might have other parts of my method sentence that would say, Vonnegut's characters are described by recounting their exploits, or at least the events of their life, while James focuses on the effect of the events on the character and on the analysis of that effect. So that gives me the sections of my paper then. Whenever I talk about Vonnegut, I'm going to talk about recounting the exploits of their lives and recounting the events of their lives. In other words, when Vonnegut has a hero, he tells you what the hero has done. When he has ordinary people, he tells you what the chief events of their life was. So it's slightly different. Then when I do James, I'm going to talk about how James is always focusing on not what happens to the characters, but what they think about, and also how he continually analyzes what they do. So that gives me 4 sections of the paper right there to play with. I might also, if I wanted another thesis sentence, I might have, or if I wanted to develop that one also, I could have said, let's see. Even though they're less fully described, Vonnegut's characters are better developed than those of Henry James. Now, that's a thesis. For method, I've got to have 3 reasons why that's so. So I might say, we know more about Vonnegut's characters. We seek Vonnegut's characters in a wider range of experiences, and Vonnegut lets the characters analyze one another rather than doing the analysis for us. Those are the 3 reasons why it's better. Then I take reason 1. I show how Vonnegut does that. I show how James fails to do that and therefore isn't as good. I take the second thing, I show how Vonnegut does it. I show how James fails to do it and therefore isn't as good. Same with the third. Then I come to my conclusion. Paper's developed, no problem. That happened to have been continuous development. Any questions on how you would put a credit honors paper together then?
Do you have any such papers that we could?
Like papers from the past, samples. There's a big box by my desk full of papers that got handed back by people. So you want to see what credit. Now they're not from Introduction to Literature because we haven't done this course before. But there's all kinds up there, from short story to American Lit, American Lit 2. It would show you what a good paper. You could at least see what a credit honors or a high honors paper in the past looked like. Most of them were, in fact, on similar topics, were similar types of papers. I think my credit honors papers are always comparison and contrast of two authors, and the high honors, in fact, you may even find some with the aesthetic criteria. Next semester I may have some samples done already, but there aren't any so far. Now, for any questions on honors then? High honors. High honors, remember, was a more difficult paper because it required originality of thought. You have to make up 5 aesthetic criteria. 5 criteria for what a good, whatever it is you're going to talk about is. In other words, you decide you want to do the drama, 5 criteria for judging a good drama. 5 criteria for judging a good short story. 5 for good novel, whichever one you want to do. Now you're going to have to do some thinking about what a good novel really is. What kind of characterization it has, maybe what kind of plot, what kind of ending it has, what the style ought to be like, whatever you decide. Whatever you decide that particular good work in that particular genre ought to have. Then what you need to do is find 2 authors within that genre. 2 short story writers, 2 novelists, and so on, and do the comparing and contrasting of them in relationship to the aesthetic criteria. For example, a thesis sentence for such a paper might be, a good novel must have a clearly identifiable point, sharply but not overdrawn characters, and then the other 5 things which are my criteria. Then, by these standards, Hemingway is superior to Vonnegut in all ways but one. Then, of course, I would take the first criteria that I had set up, a clearly identifiable point. And I would talk about what I mean by clearly identifiable point. The reader should know what the novel as a whole is meant to convey to them in the level of abstract ideas. What is the abstract idea of these novels? How easy are they to get at? And I would point out what the idea is in, say, The Sun Also Rises. How cleverly Hemingway manages to develop that theme. Then I would point out how Vonnegut doesn't develop a central plot in his. There may be 3 or 4 understandings of Vonnegut's novel, and develop a little bit, again, showing detail, adding some illustrative examples, why his isn't as good as Hemingway's. Then I go on to the next criteria, next section of the paper, and talk about sharply but not overdrawn characters. Define what I mean by sharply drawn characters, define what I mean by overdrawn characters. Show how Hemingway has some sharply drawn characters but doesn't have any overdrawn ones. Show how Vonnegut doesn't have very many sharply drawn characters but does have some that are overdrawn. And then go on to the next. Yes?
When you're doing this, would it be possible to incorporate, say you did what you said, but you found that Hemingway, when you developed your 5 criteria, you found that one of the authors met the criteria better than the other author on, say, one of the criteria, but fell short on the other 4.
Then you would probably try to have a thesis which would say, as this one is. This one says that. By these standards, Hemingway is superior to Vonnegut in all ways but one. You might come to the conclusion, because after you may decide to read some authors first to find out which authors you like, and then set up your criteria. And you might find out that both authors were good, but that they were good in different ways. Then you're going to have to slant your thesis a little bit and say that according to these criteria, both of these authors are good, but they're good in different, one is better at plot than the other. or one is more interesting than the other, but the other one is talking about deeper philosophic ideas, for example. Main thing to do on this paper is to do some reading in the genre that you pick. Figure out the 5 characteristics of a good, whatever that is, a good short story, for example. Write them down. One way to develop them is, in fact, in this paper, you might have a section, now shorter than the other two, but a shorter first section in which you develop those criteria, where you do your explaining. And then another section where you compare them, apply them to one author, and then another where you compare them to another author and contrast them with the first, or a place where you apply the criteria to both authors, one after the other, but make the comparison of how they're similar or different. Yes?
Before I make my selection, I'd like to know the difference between a short essay and a long essay.
Oh, that's not till we get to the test. That's not relevant
But
to
if
the
I
paper.
start my paper, I'd like to know what
Oh. Well, the short essays, when we get that part of the test, are about a paragraph or 2 paragraphs long, and you're required to have somewhere in there the 5 characteristics of Romanticism and how they differ from the 5 other characteristics of rationalism.
And that's testing center?
Yeah, now that's not till the end. The test that you're taking in the testing center now is the midterm test. It's the test on the first 5 units. It has no essays on it at all. It's exactly what I told you today, or pretty close to that. 90% similar to what we did in the seminar.
Is it going to be multiple choice?
No, it'll mostly be matching the
Matching, right?
definition and the term, and then in the back part matching the term and examples of the
Right.
term. But that's all there is on the midterm. On the final, there's an objective part where you'll match up neoclassicism with its definition and metaphysical with its definition. Then there'll be a short essay part in which you compare the characteristics of the two. And then there'll be a long essay which will probably require discussing and interpreting either a poem or a short story which all of us signed ahead of time, or maybe the novels that we read during the course.
No one ever fails your
My
terms.
objectives tests. Nobody ever fails my term. Besides, if you fail it, you take it over again.
What about these ones, though? Your essays and stuff?
My essays? Well, sometimes people go for high honors and don't give me a high honors paper. If that occurs, and this is why we're doing this is why the paper isn't due the last day of the semester. If you give me a high honors paper and it's not okay on that level, I will give it back to you with specific ways to change the paper. What generally happens is the paper will have a lot of good ideas, but they won't have developed one of them. And then you get it back and it'll say, now I need 1 or 2 examples for this point in your paper. And then you just add those in and give me the paper back, and if they work, then I say, okay, that's okay for high honors. If they don't work, I'll give it back to you again and say, well, this one is good, but this one doesn't seem to prove your point. You need to add a little bit more here, and you revise that, and you turn it back in, and then it becomes high honors.
When do we have to have it by?
3 weeks. I don't know what the due date is. We figured not next Thursday or the Thursday after, but the Thursday after that, the paper should be due. That's, I think, what are we in now, the 6th week? I think we're in the 6th, so it would be the 9th week the paper would be due. That seem like an unreasonably short time?
Yes, yes.
All right, the paper will be due the 10th week. I can't go much past the 10th week because there has to be time for me to correct them, which is going to take 2 weeks, and then to give them back to you and you to correct them if they need correction and come back to me. If I move it too much past the 10th week, we're not going to have time to go through that process. All right, they're due the 10th week then of the course, which is 4 weeks from today. Any other questions on how to do the paper or document it or anything else?
If we have questions, can we just ask you along?
Oh, sure. Sure, definitely. In fact, once you've got to start on the paper, if you have any questions on where to go with it after you've done your gathering your research, come up to me on the break. I'm over there in my office. I'm always there before I come to class, and usually even after for a while. So, if you got it, just come up and tell me. You might even, if you have any question on where to go with the paper, just ask. Okay, so we will meet next week for the big group, but we don't meet for the seminar. Seminar is the free time when you go take the test. You can take the test anytime during the semester. I try to get out of the way in the next couple of weeks, though, but whenever you want, as long as it's done before the end of the semester. No, we meet here at 1:30
Oh, right.
for the regular, for neoclassic, for classicism in the medieval. That's what we're on next.